On the morning of January 2nd, 1935, in a small county courthouse in rural New Jersey, a trial opened that would draw a larger crowd of reporters than any event since the end of the First World War. The victim was a 20-month-old child. The boy's father was Charles Lindbergh, the most famous man on earth. 8 years earlier, Lindbergh had flown alone across the Atlantic Ocean and become a living legend. The defendant was an immigrant carpenter named Bruno Richard Hauptmann. The case against him rested on ransom money, on handwriting, and above all, on a homemade wooden ladder. The press called it the trial of the century. This is the Lindbergh kidnapping trial. To understand the trial, you have to go back almost 3 years to a stormy evening in March of 1932. Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne had built a secluded house near Hopewell, New Jersey, partly to escape the relentless fame that followed them everywhere. On the night of March 1st, 1932, their first child, Charles Lindbergh Jr., 20 months old, was put to bed in a second-floor nursery. At around 10 o'clock, the child's nurse went to check on him. The crib was empty. On the windowsill of the nursery lay an envelope. Below the window, outside in the mud, investigators found a crude, homemade wooden ladder, broken in one section. The envelope held a ransom note. It demanded $50,000. It was written in awkward English, with a distinct misspelling pattern, and it was marked with a strange symbol, 2 interlocking circles with 3 holes punched through them. That symbol would appear on every ransom note that followed. There were 13 more.
I came home that night to find my house full of police and my son gone. We did everything the notes demanded. We kept the police back. We raised the money. We followed every instruction. I wanted only one thing: to bring my boy home.
The kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby became the biggest news story in the world. And it pulled into its orbit a parade of strange characters. The negotiations with the kidnapper were not handled by the police. They were handled, astonishingly, by a retired school teacher from the Bronx named Dr. John Condon. Condon was an elderly, theatrical man who placed a letter in a Bronx newspaper offering himself as a go-between. To everyone's surprise, the kidnapper answered him. Condon began exchanging coded messages with a man he would only ever know by a single name.
I met the fellow at night in a cemetery among the gravestones. He kept the shadows. He spoke with a German accent, and he told me to call him John. And John said to me, in that accent, a phrase I have never forgotten. He asked me, would I burn if the baby is dead?
In April 1932, Condon delivered the ransom, $50,000, to the man called John in a Bronx cemetery at night. But the money had been prepared with a trap inside it. On the advice of a treasury agent, much of the ransom was paid in gold certificates, a type of paper currency that was about to be pulled out of circulation. And the serial numbers of every bill were recorded. The plan was simple. Sooner or later, the kidnapper would have to spend that money. And when he did, the marked bills would surface. The baby was not returned. On May 12, 1932, more than 2 months after the kidnapping, the body of a small child was found in the woods, a few miles from the Lindbergh house. The Lindbergh baby was dead, and had, the coroner believed, been dead since the night he was taken. For 2.5 years, the marked ransom bills trickled out across New York City. Treasury agents tracked each one, and then in September 1934, a gas station attendant took a $10 gold certificate from a customer. The attendant thought the gold note was unusual, and he wrote the customer's license plate number on the bill. That license plate led police to a house in the Bronx and to a 35-year-old German immigrant carpenter named Bruno Richard Hauptmann. When detectives searched Hauptmann's garage, they found more than $14,000 of the Lindbergh ransom money hidden in the walls. Hauptmann had an explanation. He said the money belonged to a friend and former business partner, a man named Isidor Fish, who had returned to Germany and then died there. Hauptmann claimed Fish had left him a box and that he had only later discovered the cash inside it. The press mockingly called it the Fish story. Hauptmann was charged with murder and extradited to New Jersey. The trial opened on January 2nd, 1935, in the small town of Flemington. On the bench sat Justice Thomas Trenchard, a dignified, old-fashioned New Jersey jurist, courtly and calm, determined to run an orderly court in the middle of a media stampede. The prosecution was led by the Attorney General of New Jersey, David Wilentz. Wilentz was sharp, ambitious, and theatrical. And remarkably, he had never tried a single criminal case before this one. The defense was led by Edward Riley, a once famous New York attorney, grand and florid, but well past his best years, and by many accounts, poorly prepared.
This court is aware of the attention that this case has drawn. I will say once and clearly, this is a court of law. It is not a theater. The defendant is entitled to a fair and orderly trial, and this court intends to see that he receives one.
The prosecution's first great witness was the most famous man in the world. On the third day of the trial, David Wilentz called Charles Lindbergh to the stand. Lindbergh testified with rigid, painful composure about the night of the kidnapping. But Wilentz was building toward one specific moment, a piece of testimony both powerful and later deeply controversial. On the night Dr. Condon had delivered the ransom in the Bronx cemetery, Charles Lindbergh had been waiting nearby in a parked car. And from that car, in the dark, Lindbergh had heard a voice call out to Condon, a stranger's voice, shouting a single phrase across the cemetery. "Hey, doctor."
Colonel Lindbergh, On that night, you heard a man's voice call out. Have you since heard that voice again?
Yes, I have heard it since.
Whose voice was it, Colonel, that you heard in the cemetery that night?
That was the voice of Bruno Richard Hauptmann.
The courtroom reacted. The most trusted man in America had just identified the defendant's voice. But think for a moment about what that identification actually was. Lindbergh had heard two words, "Hey, doctor," shouted in the dark nearly 3 years earlier. From a distance, he had heard Hauptmann speak only recently, in police custody, after Hauptmann was already the accused. As courtroom evidence, a voice identification like that was, by any modern standard, extraordinarily weak. But it did not come from an ordinary witness. It came from Lindbergh. The prosecution's case against Hauptmann rested on 3 pillars. The first was the ransom money. The second was handwriting. And the third, the strangest and the most decisive, was a ladder. The money was the strongest pillar. Over $14,000 of the Lindbergh ransom had been found hidden in Hauptmann's own garage. His explanation, the dead friend, the box left behind, struck the jury as a story too convenient to believe. The handwriting was the second pillar. The prosecution brought in a team of 8 handwriting experts who testified that the writing on the ransom notes matched samples of Hauptmann's writing. The defense called experts of its own to disagree. To the jury, it was a confusing duel of specialists, and the misspellings in the notes, which matched the patterns of a German speaker, quietly did real damage. But the pillar that the whole prosecution truly rested on was the ladder, the crude, homemade ladder found beneath the nursery window. The prosecution called a wood expert from the United States Forest Service, a man named Arthur Kohler, who had spent years studying that ladder. Kohler had traced the lumber, and he testified to something that stunned the courtroom. One specific board in the ladder, known in the case as Rail 16, had not, he said, simply been bought at a store.
Mr. Kohler, you have examined this rail of the kidnap ladder, and you went to the defendant's home. Tell this jury what you found in the attic of Bruno Richard Hauptmann.
Kohler testified that in Hauptmann's attic, a section of floorboard had been cut away and was missing. And he testified that the missing floorboard and the ladder rail were once the same piece of wood, that the grain matched, that the nail holes lined up with the attic joists. In other words, the prosecution claimed, Hauptmann had walked into his own attic, pried up a floorboard, and built it into the ladder used to steal the Lindbergh baby. It was vivid, memorable, and devastating. The defense should have torn into it. A homemade ladder is not a fingerprint. The wood grain match was complex, technical testimony that a sharp cross-examination could have shaken. But Edward Riley's defense was disorganized and overmatched. Riley even told the press that he believed his own client was probably involved. A catastrophe for any defense attorney. Through all of it, Bruno Richard Hauptmann sat in the courtroom and insisted he was innocent. When he took the stand in his own defense, he did not waver.
I am not the man. I have told you where the money came from. It was left with me by fish. I did not write those letters. I did not build that ladder from my floor. I was not in New Jersey. I never in my life saw that child.
On cross-examination, David Willents was merciless. For days, he hammered Hauptmann over the money, the handwriting, his missing alibi, and a piece of evidence that genuinely hurt. Dr. Condon's address and telephone number had been found penciled inside a closet in Hauptmann's own home. Hauptmann said he must have written it down out of idle curiosity about a famous case. The jury did not believe him. To understand the verdict, you have to step outside the courtroom and look at the town of Flemington, New Jersey in January 1935. Curator, Flemington was a quiet town of around 2,700 people. During the trial, it was swamped by an estimated 60,000 visitors. More than 300 reporters crowded into the courthouse. Telegraph companies strung enough wire to carry on some days more than 1 million words of trial coverage to the world. Outside, it was a carnival. Vendors sold sandwiches and they sold miniature souvenir ladders, tiny replicas of the kidnap ladder, sold as toys while a man's life was being decided indoors. Spectators fought for courtroom seats. Celebrities dropped in to watch as if it were a show. And inside, the trial itself had become impossible to fully control. At its dramatic peaks, the spectators in the gallery reacted out loud, gasping, murmuring, and on at least one occasion, applauding the prosecutor.
There will be order in this courtroom. I have warned this gallery before. This is not a performance. A man is on trial for his life. If there is another outburst, this courtroom will be cleared, and it will remain cleared for the duration of this trial.
Years later, this atmosphere would become the heart of the case's legal legacy. Legal scholars and judges would point to Flemington as the textbook example of what happens when a trial becomes a spectacle. When the pressure of a watching, roaring public presses in on 12 jurors who are supposed to decide in calm. On February 11th, 1935, the lawyers finished. David Willents, in his summation, called Hauptmann every brutal name he could find and demanded the electric chair. And then Justice Trenchard delivered his charge to the jury. Trenchard's charge was, by the standards of the law, firmly worded. As he summarized the evidence, he repeatedly asked the jury, in effect, whether they truly found the defense witnesses credible, whether the fish story was believable at all. Critics ever after argued that the charge leaned hard toward the prosecution. The jury then retired to decide. The jury of New Jersey citizens deliberated for more than 11 hours. Outside the courthouse, a crowd in the thousands waited in the cold winter night. Some in that crowd were reportedly chanting for a death sentence at around 10:30 at night. On February 13th, 1935, the jury filed back in. Bruno Richard Hauptmann stood to face them.
Members of the jury, have you agreed upon a verdict?
The foreman rose.
We find the defendant, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, guilty of murder in the first degree.
Guilty in the first degree. And under New Jersey law, because the jury had not recommended mercy, the verdict carried an automatic sentence: death in the electric chair. Hauptmann received the verdict almost without expression. He had insisted he was innocent from the day of his arrest, and he would insist on it for the rest of his life.
I am absolutely innocent of the crime of murder. I could tell you more, but the verdict is in. You may kill an innocent man, but I will not say that I did this thing.
The defense appealed. The conviction was upheld. The governor of New Jersey, Harold Hoffman, who had real private doubts about the case, secretly visited Hauptmann in his cell and granted a 30-day reprieve, hoping new evidence would surface. None that changed the outcome ever did. On April 3rd, 1936, more than 4 years after the Lindbergh baby was taken, Bruno Richard Hauptmann was executed in the electric chair at the New Jersey State Prison. He maintained his innocence to the end. The Lindbergh case left a deep mark on American law. The kidnapping itself had already prompted Congress in 1932 to pass what became known as the Lindbergh Law, making kidnapping a federal crime once a victim was taken across state lines. But the trial left a second mark, a warning. The chaos at Flemington, the cameras, the souvenir ladders, the chanting crowd, the gallery applauding the prosecutor, all of it became the standard example of a trial swallowed by publicity. In the years that followed, the American Bar Association tightened its rules on cameras and broadcasting in courtrooms, reforms driven in large part by the memory of this case. And the doubts never went away. For decades afterward, researchers, journalists, and Hauptmann's widow, Anna, who lived into her 90s and never stopped insisting on his innocence, argued that the evidence had been overstated, that some of it may have been mishandled, that the Wood testimony was less certain than the jury was told. Other researchers re-examined the same case and concluded the verdict was sound. The argument has never fully ended. As for Charles Lindbergh, the most famous man of his age, the kidnapping changed his life completely. Hounded by the press, even in his grief, the Lindbergh family left the United States entirely and lived for years in Europe, trying to find the privacy that fame had taken from them. The trial of Bruno Richard Hauptmann convicted a man and closed the case that had haunted a nation. But it is remembered in the law for something else, for what it looked like. A courtroom surrounded by 60,000 spectators. A man's life decided in the middle of the loudest show on earth. And the hard question it left behind? Whether 12 human beings can ever truly judge in quiet while the whole world stands outside the window and chants. If you want to come with us to other courtrooms, to the trial of Lizzie Borden, to the dock at Nuremberg, to a Los Angeles courtroom where a glove would not fit. Subscribe to the highest court, because a fair trial needs more than good evidence. It needs a room calm enough for 12 people to actually think.